relationship with God. We see them being blessed by God. And we want it. That's a good thing. But the way he went about it wasn't so good. So in Genesis 27, we see the story of Jacob stealing Esau's blessing with the help of his mother through the trickery. However, this wasn't just a bad deal that he offered him. This was outright deception. See, Isaac was old and couldn't see. He asked his firstborn son Esau to go into the field and fix some wild game for him so he could give him his blessing. Rebekah overheard it. She told Jacob to get 2 choice kids from the flock. She knew she could cook faster than he could hunt, right? So, and Rebekah basically told Jacob that we have a plan here. We're going to make sure that you get the blessing instead of Esau. And Jacob was like, this is a bad idea. This is going to involve a curse. And what did Rebekah say? Let the curse fall on me. Jacob agreed. He went out to his father, pretending to be Esau. He took the meal that his mother prepared from the 2 kids, and since Esau was hairy and he wasn't, Rebekah placed goat skins on his arm, and Isaac fell for it. Isaac placed all his blessings on Jacob. Then Esau prepared his food and came out to meet Isaac. Isaac told Esau he had already given all his blessings away. And in Genesis 27:36 says, Esau exclaimed, "No wonder his name is Jacob, for now he has cheated me twice. For he took my rights as a firstborn, and now he has stolen my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved even one blessing for me?" Isaac did indeed give Esau a blessing, but his blessing was more of a curse. As a result, Esau threatened to kill Jacob once Isaac died. Genesis 27:41 says, "From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to scheme, 'I will soon be mourning my father's death. Then I will kill my brother Jacob.' Now Rebekah found out about this as well and feared for her son's safety. And Genesis 27:43 says, "So listen carefully, my son," Rebekah tells Jacob. "Get ready to flee to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay there with him until your brother cools off. When he calms down and forgets what you have done to him, I will send for you to come back. Why should I lose both of you in one day?" So now Esau had married 2 Canaanite women, and they both were a source of grief for Isaac and Rebekah. So Rebekah convinces Isaac that Jacob needs to leave and go find a wife from their relatives. And that's a good thing too, right? Because after all, that's what Abraham's servant did for Isaac. He went to their homeland, found him a wife. And so sure enough, Isaac said, "Sure, that's a good idea. Let's go." And so this trip that Jacob made to Padan Aram was no small trip. It was one source I read said it might have been 400 miles. I mean, this was a huge feat for Jacob and a huge mark of him becoming an adult. And so this is really where we will begin. So, number 1, we're going to see how God was faithful to Jacob. Number 1, God honored Isaac's blessing and passed on the covenant promise to Jacob. Genesis 28. Now, if you guys want to follow along, you are free to turn to Genesis 28 because I'll be kind of jumping around for the next few chapters. But if you'd like to look in your own Bible and see what it says in your version, you can look at Genesis 28, verse 1. So Isaac called for Jacob, blessed him, and said, "You must not marry any of these Canaanite women. Instead, go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of your grandfather Bethuel, and marry one of your uncle Laban's daughters. May God Almighty bless you and give you many children, and may your descendants multiply and become many nations. May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessing he promised to Abraham. May you own the land where you are now living as a foreigner, for God gave this land to Abraham." So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to stay with his uncle Laban, his mother's brother, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean. Let's skip down to verse 10. We'll see what happened. Meanwhile, Jacob left Beersheba and traveled towards Haran. At sundown, he arrived at a good place to set up camp and stopped there for the night. Jacob found a stone to rest his head against and lay down to sleep. As he slept, he dreamed of a stairway that reached from the earth up to heaven, and he saw the angels of God going up and down the stairway. At the top of the stairway stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. The ground you are lying on belongs to you. I am giving it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will spread out in all directions, to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. And all the families of earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. What's more, I am with you, and I will protect you wherever you go. One day I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have finished giving you everything I have promised you. Let's keep going. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I wasn't aware of it. But he was afraid and said, What an awesome place this is. It is none other than the house of God, the very gateway to heaven. The next morning, Jacob got up very early. He took the stone he had rested his head against and set it upright as a memorial pillar. Then he poured olive oil over it. He named the place Bethel, which means house of God, although it was previously called Luz. Then Jacob made this vow. If God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will certainly be my God, and this memorial pillar I have set up will become a place for worshiping God, and I will present to God a tenth of everything he gives me. So, though it wasn't achieved the right way, God still honored the blessing that Isaac made to Jacob. Here we see God's faithfulness in the fact that even though the blessing wasn't passed on to the firstborn, God still honored it. In this way, Jacob's faith and the covenant promise was indeed transferred. Okay, let me say that again. In this way, Isaac's faith and the covenant promise was indeed transferred to Jacob, as we can see. And the covenant promise had eternal consequences, not only for Jacob, but his descendants as well. Now, this dream was a statement of Jacob's new authority and access to heaven, but it was actually also a prophecy about Jesus himself. And what's crazy is I'm reading in John in my Bible reading, and I just read this, and I was like, wow, this blew my mind. John 1:51 says, and Jesus was meeting with his first disciples, and he said, I tell you the truth, you will all see heaven open and the angels of God going up and down on the Son of Man, the one who is the stairway between heaven and earth. Jesus is the stairway between heaven and earth. And Jacob saw like an early picture of that. Jesus also gives us access to heaven, right? He gives us authority, and he gives us the blessings that come with the new covenant. So we, too, are under the covenant blessing of God. And we, too, have authority. We, too, have access to heaven, just like Jacob did, but in the new covenant. Okay, number 2, God led Jacob safely to his destination. So Jacob indeed arrived in Padan Aram safely, where he met some shepherds by a well who introduced him to his cousin Rachel. Genesis 29, verse 9 says, Jacob was still talking with them when Rachel arrived with her father's flock, for she was a shepherd. And because Rachel was his cousin, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and because the sheep and goats belonged to his uncle Laban, Jacob went over to the well and moved the stone from its mouth and watered his uncle's flock. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and he wept aloud. He exclaimed to Rachel that he was her cousin on her father's side, the son of her aunt Rebekah. So Rachel quickly ran and told her father Laban. As soon as Laban heard that his nephew Jacob had arrived, he ran out to meet him. He embraced and kissed him and brought him home. When Jacob had told him his story, Laban exclaimed, "You really are my own flesh and blood." God was already at work, making sure Jacob arrived safely in Padan Aram. 3, God gave Jacob a family of his own. This is where things get a little complicated. See, Jacob loved Rachel. He didn't really want to marry anybody else. But Laban tricked him into marrying both his daughters, Leah and Rachel. Genesis 29, verse 16 says, "Now Laban had 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was named Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. Since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, 'I'll work for you 7 years if you'll give me Rachel, your daughter, as my wife.' 'Agreed,' Laban replied. 'I'd rather give her to you than to anyone else. Stay and work with me.' So Jacob worked 7 years to pay for Rachel, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days. Finally, the time came for him to marry her. 'I have fulfilled my agreement,' Jacob said to Laban. 'Now give me my wife so I can sleep with her.' So Laban invited everyone in the neighborhood and prepared a wedding feast. But that night, when it was dark, Laban took Leah to Jacob, and he slept with her. Laban had given Leah a servant, Zilpah, to be her maid. But when Jacob woke up in the morning, it was Leah. 'What have you done to me?' Jacob raged to Laban. 'I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why have you tricked me?' 'It's not our custom here to marry off the younger daughter ahead of the firstborn,' Laban replied. 'But wait until the bridal week is over. Then we'll give you Rachel too, provided you promise to work another 7 years for me.' So Jacob agreed to work 7 more years. A week after Jacob married Leah, Laban gave him Rachel too. Laban gave Rachel a servant, Bilhah, to be her maid. So Jacob slept with Rachel too, and he loved her much more than Leah. Then he stayed and worked for Laban an additional 7 years. Here we see Jacob experiencing the consequences of his action. He deceived his brother and father, and now his uncle deceived him. Yet even though he had experienced some consequences, he was still living under the covenant blessing of God. And sometimes we experience consequences too, but we don't have to be living like this our whole life. Man, I have to experience No, we can still have joy in the midst of consequences. We can still live under the blessing of God, the covenant of God, even if we have to experience some consequences, right? We don't have to we don't have to constantly live in this state of condemnation. You can have joy in the midst of a consequence. It's okay. You are still under the covenant blessing of God. So is Jacob, right? So now, in the end of Genesis 29 and the beginning of Genesis 30, this narrative plays out where Leah, who was unloved, gets to have 6 sons. And, Rachel, out of desperation, tells Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." And Jacob's like, "I'm not God. I can't really do that for you." And so then she gets desperate and offers her servant up to be his wife. And her servant, Bilhah, bores Jacob 2 sons. Okay? Well, at that time, Leah stopped having kids. So Leah thinks, well, that's kind of a good idea, Rachel. I think I'll try that myself. And she offers her servant, Zilpah, up to be a maid. Can you see the competition happening here, right? And anyways, so then finally God opens Rachel's womb and Joseph is born. Leah has another daughter named Dinah, and much later on, Rachel gave birth to one more son, Benjamin, on her deathbed. So from this story, you can see that there's a reason why God instituted the marriage relationship in the Garden of Eden the way he did. One man and one woman. It just works. It works, okay? Jacob marrying 4 women wasn't God's plan either. In fact, for Jacob, this led to even further unwanted consequences. But we can see how God still blessed Jacob. I mean, on one hand, He probably would have rather just had Rachel as his wife and, lived happily ever after. Well, now he had 4 wives, and it probably wasn't what he wanted, right? But guess what? And even though she did die early, he still got to marry the love of his life. Now, we could do a whole nother sermon of Leah and Rachel, and I've heard sermons like that, but tonight we're just focusing on Jacob, okay? God loved Leah and Rachel, and he showed him his love to them as well. But we're just focusing on Jacob, okay? We're mostly focusing on Jacob, of course. Now, the other thing is God promised Jacob many descendants, and as we can see, that promise definitely came to fulfillment. Okay? So number 4, God gave Jacob all he needed and more. Jacob worked for Laban 14 years total for Leah and Rachel, but he worked 6 additional years to build up his flock. Here we can see another way he was cheated by Laban. In Genesis 30, Laban realized that because of Jacob, he had been blessed. So he thought that keeping Jacob around for a while would be a pretty good idea. He asked Jacob to name his wages. Jacob just asked for a small percentage, and basically he asked for the streaked, speckled, and spotted sheep of Laban's flock, which weren't really that many, maybe about 20%. We really don't exactly know, but it was a small percentage. He didn't ask for much. Laban agreed, of course, but then he secretly removed all of those streaked, speckled, and spotted sheep out of his flock and put him a 3-day journey between Jacob and those sheep and put his sons in charge so that Jacob wouldn't get a whole lot, because then, hey, Jacob's got to stay around for longer, right? So, but the problem is, well, God kind of started to see these things. Now, the Bible does tell us that Jacob actually did use some scientific strategies. I'm going to say strategies. 2 of them really had no scientific value. Maybe it was just something that they did back in the day. But he actually did use some strategies to try to grow his flock. The only one that might have actually helped was focusing on the stronger sheep for breeding. But really, it was God who worked miraculously in Jacob's life to ensure that he would get flocks and that he would be able to grow his flocks. So, the problem is this irritated Laban. And the reason why is his sons started to complain. They're like, we're losing our inheritance here. And as we will read in a minute, Laban's attitude starts to change. But God was still working in here because God was preparing Jacob to head back home. So let's read Genesis 31, verse 3. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your father and grandfather and to your relatives there, and I will be with you. So Jacob called Rachel and Leah out to the field where he was watching his flock. He said to them, I have noticed that your father's attitude toward me has changed, but the God of my father has been with me. You know how hard I have worked for your father, but he has cheated me, changing my wages 10 times. But God has not allowed him to do me any harm. For if he said, the speckled animals will be your wages, the whole flock began to produce speckled young. And when he changed his mind and said, the striped animals will become your wages, then the whole flock began to produce striped young. In this way, God has taken your father's animals and given them to me. One time during the mating season, I had a dream and saw that the male goats mating with the females were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then in my dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob. And I replied, yes, here I am. The angel said, look up and you will see that only streaked, speckled, and spotted males are mating with the females of your flock. For I have seen how Laban has treated you, and I am the God who appeared to you at Bethel, the place where you anointed the pillar of stone and made your vow to me. Now get ready and leave this country and return to the land of your birth. Rachel and Leah responded, that's fine with us. We won't inherit any of our father's wealth anyway. He has reduced our rights to those of foreign women. And after he sold us, he wasted the money you paid him for us. All the wealth God has given you from our father legally belongs to us and our children. So go ahead and do whatever God has told you." So Jacob put his wives and children on camels, and he drove all his livestock in front of him. He packed all the belongings he had acquired in Padan Aram and set out for the land of Canaan where his father Isaac lived. So you can even see how God prepared Leah and Rachel's heart to leave their father. I mean, God was working in this whole thing. So number 5, God brought Jacob safely back to Canaan, fulfilling the promise he had made 20 years ago. And again, there is much more to this story that I can even say in one message. God protected Jacob from Laban. When Laban realized that Jacob left, he pursued him. But first he had the dream. God told him to leave Jacob alone. When he finally met up with Jacob, they had an argument, but they ended up making a treaty and parting safely. Laban was now out of the picture, but that wasn't the end of Jacob's problems, right? What was coming next? His reunion with his brother Esau. And here, Jacob's a little afraid. So he prays. And this is in Genesis 32, verse 9, we see Jacob's prayer. Then Jacob prayed, "O God of my grandfather Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you told me, return to your own land and to your relatives, and you promised me I will treat you kindly. I am not worthy of all the unfailing love and faithfulness you have shown me, your servant. When I left home and crossed the Jordan River, I owned nothing except a walking stick. Now my household fills 2 large camps. O Lord, please rescue me from the hand of my brother Esau. I am afraid that he is coming to attack me along with my wives and children. But you promised me, I will surely treat you kindly, and I will multiply your descendants until they become as numerous as the sands along the seashore, too many to count." And that night, Jacob wrestled with God in a dream. Jacob wrestled with God, and God changed his name to Israel, which means God perseveres, or one who prevails with God. Jacob was no longer the usurper, but he was one who persevered with God. God answered Jacob's prayer, and in Genesis 33, the 2 brothers finally meet. And Esau reunited with Jacob, and he received him warmly. It was a reunion that far exceeded Jacob's expectations. Much later on, Jacob's sons sold Joseph into slavery. Jacob thought that Joseph was lost forever, but in Genesis 45, Joseph reunites with his brothers. When Jacob found out he was still alive, God met Jacob in a vision. Genesis 46, verse 1 says, "So Jacob set out from Egypt with all his possessions, and when he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. During the night, God spoke to him in a vision. 'Jacob, Jacob,' he called. 'Here I am,' Jacob replied. 'I am God, the God of your father,' the voice said. 'Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you a family, I'll make your family into a great nation.' Jacob died while being surrounded by all of his sons, but before he died, I believe the Lord inspired him to make one more promise. Genesis 48:21 says, "Then Jacob said to Joseph, 'Look, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will take you back to Canaan, the land of your ancestors.'" And as we know from the next few books of the Bible, that promise also came to pass. In conclusion, God is faithful. Jacob is just one example. God fulfilled every part of the covenant promise and blessing to Jacob. He honored the blessing that was spoken by Isaac. He led Jacob safely to Padan Aram. He gave Jacob a family of his own and all that he needed. He led Jacob safely back to Canaan. As I previously mentioned, the covenant promise had eternal consequences not only for Jacob, but also for his descendants. It was Jacob's descendants who would get to experience God's miraculous deliverance from Egypt. It was Jacob's descendants who would enjoy the promised land. It was Jacob's descendants that even though they were exiled, God brought them back to the land. It was Jacob's descendants who would get to bring in the Savior of the world. And it is Jacob's descendants still who live under the covenant blessing today. But so do we. We live under the new covenant blessing. And just as God was faithful to Jacob, he is always faithful to us. Why? Because he's the same God yesterday, today, and forever. Think about your own life. How have you benefited from being under the covenant blessing of God? I can tell you it changed my whole life. Finding the Lord has changed my entire life, and it set me on the right trajectory, and I don't know what my life would be without it. How have you seen God's faithfulness in your own life? We need to routinely take time to remember and recount God's faithfulness to us. And don't forget how he has blessed us. At this time, I would like to invite the worship team to come up. And we sang this song last week.